Welcome to Classical Top 5 and to 2021. Not quite the happy new year any of us were expecting, is it? But your favourite friendly classical music discussion podcast is here to help you through and hopefully provide some welcome distraction from the horrors outside, although it is a comfort to know that you can put the Jonas Kaufmann Christmas album away for another year. Richard Bratby and Charlotte Gardner are here. Hello, both. How was your little time away, your little holiday? Richard, what did you get up to?
Well, it's. I was just saying to some friends, you sort of have these ideas you're going to use the holiday very productively, and this year has been obviously isolation. All the social events cancelled, nowhere to go really. Fairly murky weather if you did want to even go for a walk. So it's just hunkering down, light the fire, pour yourself some booze. And I was telling myself I should be doing some work. I'm writing a book about a major UK orchestra, which will have to remain anonymous for the time being, and I should have been ploughing through their boxes of research. I've got boxes of old reviews and files and contracts and things. I ought to have been ploughing through them and assimilating them and generally getting on top of it. But it's something about that period between Christmas and New Year, at the start of January, you just want to slob out and turn the telly on and see if they're re-showing, Gremlins 2 or something like that, and that seems to be what I did. It's utterly unproductive. I did review the New Year's Day concert from Vienna without going to Vienna, which I think kind of defeats the whole, as a critic, doing the review without getting at least a free trip out of it is an absolute sign of how far things have fallen, but there we are.
Wow. God, I'd love to slob out. I've just spent most of the time trying to stop my twins from headbutting each other. What about you, Charlotte? What have you been up to?
Well, I take a similar attitude to Christmas as Richard, actually. It's the time for slobbing out and not doing very much. So we had our own sort of family disaster area of dead rodent found in the Christmas tree, another dead rodent deposited on our patio on New Year's Eve. Mm-hmm. Our Christmas goose never arrived in the online shop. So that was a last minute dash to Tesco just to get anything off the bare shelves. So that was all very interesting. But since getting back, life has actually been a lot better. There've been no disasters yet in comparison to a sort of disaster-ridden Christmas. And I've actually, obviously things are awful right now, but I have at least got a nice job at the moment writing the program notes for a summer music festival. And so it's nice to have something positive to look forward to. And of course, the wonderful thing about just being given a whole pile of program notes for a huge amount of concerts and just pieces of music is that you're forced to play musical detective. You're given 3 sonatas and you have to work out what links there might be between all of them and find a narrative without actually putting words in an artist's mouth. And I find it such an interesting exercise each time I do it. And right now I'm absolutely immersed in it.
One of the big changes this time round with our lockdown here in the UK, especially since we've been so used to watching streaming concerts, haven't we? We've got used to that. All the orchestras doing something online, and they're not doing them at the moment, or most of them aren't. Many of the big orchestras in the UK have shut down completely. Really, they're not doing streaming. They're not doing performances, of course, to audiences. The LSO has just announced that it's not going to be doing any streaming for the next 2 weeks or any rehearsals of any kind. So it's not getting together. Many of the orchestras have made the decision that it's just not worth the risk having that many people in the room. The Wigmore Hall, that's been leading the way really with these kinds of concerts, and of course has a much smaller number of people on the stage, that's decided to cancel most of the concerts for the next month. So it's not looking great for public performance at the moment. So the landscape has changed a lot, hasn't it? But anyway, just to cheer us all up, Charlotte, you came up with the idea, given that everybody's isolated, let's choose a subject of solo instrumental works. Yes, exactly.
Thanks, Gardner.
but it's a good one. So our subject then is it's solo instrumental works. Now, before we get into that, I do want to remind everyone that we did in our last edition of 2020 have a competition to win an exclusive Classic Top 5 face mask. Thank you to everyone that entered. Answering the question, which of our guests said if they never performed Walton's Belshazzar's Feast again, it would be too soon? It was, of course, Simon Housey. The winner that was picked at random, and congratulations, is our listener, Tony Henwood. Congratulations, Tony. That Classical Top 5 mask will be making its way to you very soon. So this week's subject, as I mentioned, solo instrumental works. So now, just to clarify then, that's pieces that are completely unaccompanied and for any instrument except the piano, because that will be getting its very own edition of the podcast. So you chose this subject, Charlotte. What reason was that? I mean, I know you have a lot of favorites in this area. What was the reason for choosing it?
I do. Well, to me, I mean, it wasn't just because we're all alone right now. This is a subject I've been wanting to do here for absolutely ages. This extraordinary intellectual exercise that composers across the ages have set themselves to take. Often an instrument which is used to only carrying a melody, often it can only play one note, and forcing it to carry a whole piece all by itself, often an extended piece. And it's an intellectual exercise for how you make that happen. A technical exercise, often it's a way, particularly strings composers have pushed the boundaries of what is possible on the instrument. And as a result, I think that it's created some of the world's finest and most memorable music. I mean, you've only got to look at Bach alone. There's that famous D minor chaconne from the second violin partita, the G major prelude for cello, and just all across, I mean, Paganini's 24th Caprice, Rachmaninoff, so many other people took it on. So for me, it's an area which is just absolutely bursting with riches, and as a result, it's been really, really hard to choose, actually.
Well, go on then. Let's. It's your subject. Take us into the first choice.
Okay, I will do that. Now, it's funny. I thought when I came to this, right, I'm not going to just be a strings person this week. And there's so much there. When you've got things like Britain's Metamorphoses and, you know, the Berlioz sequenzas and all these wonderful things, syrinx.
Don't mention all our choices.
Sorry,
we've even started. Go for your one first.
Going to. So yeah, I'm starting. I'm afraid when the chips were down, it's all strings for me this week. I'm really sorry. In fact, I have this nasty feeling it might even be all violin. And I've started with Tellemann's violin fantasias. Now, these, Richard's face. So I've talked in the past about how Vivaldi was a savvy businessman, and the same was true of Telemann. So while he had Vivaldi going into the publishing market, finding interesting titles to tempt people to buy his music, Telemann also was all about the common man. So he was far actually more widely revered and known in his day than Bach was, to the extent that he set up his own publishing house due to public demand and started publishing at his own cost collections for various instruments. And that was off the back of publishing a monthly periodical where he would present new pieces of music by him and other composers. So he was really about the common man. And as part of his publishing house, he created 4 collections of fantasias, each for a different instrument. He did harpsichord, violin, viola da gamba, and flute. And these ones, interestingly, they were less about pushing technique and more about creating something beautiful that people like us could play in their own homes. Now, obviously, if you're Fabio Biondi, you're going to sound better playing the violin fantasias than I would. But still, it's actually something that's within our limits. And actually, I think I probably said before, the Telemann recorder fantasias, I'll just go and pick it up for a screen break sometimes, because it's the kind of music that we can actually play. Now, it was really hard to know which ones to choose, but I did go for the violin. But I should just give a shout to the Gamba fantasias, because they were only discovered in 2015. And of course, they're lovely. And so there's been a steady stream of recordings ever since. But back to the violin. Now, Telemann himself was a highly competent violinist. He played it, he had to play it for his job, and he understood its technical abilities. But at the same time, he wasn't a violinist on the scale that Bach was a violinist. And clearly he got terrified at points. There's this wonderful quote. When he was at court at Eisenach, he describes how when he knew that he was about to play a concerto with a well-known virtuoso of the time, he used to go and hide himself in his room for days, practicing with my sleeve rolled up and my nerves rubbed with fortifying balm. And so the fantasias, they're clearly pushing him, they're pushing us. They're music to get your teeth into, but they're not too difficult. And there's this wonderful stylistic tussle in them between the old polyphonic fugal style and the new singing galant French style. And I've chosen the B flat major first fantasia, which is a galant style one. And it is just absolutely heavenly. It opens with this lilting, nostalgic bittersweet largo. It sounds very French, with wonderful, huge angular chords and intervals rather. And what I love about it is that every single time I hear it, I'm hearing an orchestra. Everything about it, I'm filling in the harmonies. I'm even hearing the various different sonorities. The bass line is so strong, and then this wonderful melody. And then the allegro points, it goes slow, fast, slow, fast. The allegro, the Corellian style, and if anyone who's a violinist will know just how fun it is to play a Corelli allegro, or the barriolage there. And that's what he's given us there. So he's given us beauty, and he's given us just fun stuff to play. And the whole thing is just, it's ravishingly beautiful in my opinion.
I think we're going to be talking a lot, aren't we, today, about how composers bring out a whole world out of just one instrument, not just in exploring the technical aspects of that instrument, but also the sound world that can be produced by that one instrument. And of course, some instruments have a much wider sound world than others. Richard, what's your first choice in this?
Well, I have had my thunder rather stolen. I was going to start with Telemann as well. I didn't think anyone would bother with Telemann because people generally don't. I came across these pieces. I was commissioned actually last year to write a series of program notes for all four selections from all four of the different sets of Telemann fantasies. And I've always been quite fond of his music. There's something about it. He just seems a tremendously likable figure. Very prolific, of course. I mean, you look at the amount of stuff he wrote. I mean, he wrote more cantatas alone than Bach, more operas than Handel, more sonatas and Vivaldi. I mean, it's just extraordinary. You look at the sort of output the man had, and you read his life. He just seems such a nice chap. Everyone liked him. He was affable. He was a businessman. Got things done. He wrote music for amateurs, which didn't patronize them, which they could enjoy, which they could afford. At the same time, he was incredibly outward looking, innovative. He's best friends with Handel. He's a keen gardener. Handel used to send him packages of exotic plants from Kew, which he'd sort of purchased in Britain and have crated up and sent over as a gift to Hamburg, where Telemann was working, as a sort of token of his esteem. I mean, Handel's quite a grumpy chap. I mean, clearly he really was very fond of Telemann. Johann Sebastian Bach christened his son Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. He's his godfather. We'll come back to that in a minute. But yeah, Telemann, he's just a likable. That likability translates through the music, and at the same time, that sort of openness to what's going on in the world of music. He wasn't a sort of old fuddy-duddy. He sort of found himself a style in the early 1700s and stuck with it, right, plodding through to the 1750s, like certain composers. He really changed. If you listen to his late music, some of his late works you could easily mistake for Gluck or middle period Haydn. He really progresses even into old age, and these fantasias are just such fun. They like Charlotte says, he's writing for amateurs, giving them something to do, understands their capacity, and at the same time, like you said, Tommy, creates a world. He sort of gives them a whole concert on a page. Each of these fantasias was printed on one page of music in this little magazine he put out. And each one is like a miniature concert. There are fantasias in the form of French overtures, in the forms of Italian overtures. There's fantasias in the forms of dance suites. There's fugues. There's passacaglias with one instrument. On a flute, a solo flute, a passacaglia on a solo flute. Imagine that. And there they all are. So you buy your subscription to Telemann's musical periodical. You get your page of music, and on that page, ready for you to play in your own home, in your own time, without the need for a keyboard, is you've got the whole world of 18th century music. You get a taste of everything that's fashionable, everything that's happening, everything that's interesting in the world of music. So what a brilliant guy, and what brilliant pieces they are. But that was going to be my first choice.
Which one? What were you going to? Which Fantasia?
I was going to home in on the entire set of flute fantasias, to be honest, just because I think it's the gamba fantasias are such interesting pieces. I mean, they're not generally played today on the instrument they were written for. The violin ones, instantly you're comparing them with Bach, and they're very, very different beasts. That's the interesting thing. But instead, I mean, my sort of other first choice I was going to throw in again. I thought, well. I guessed what Charlotte's first choice was going to be. I got it wrong. I was going to counter by saying, well, I'm going for Bach. The the most influential Bach in the 18th century, the most respected, widely admired, widely imitated Bach in the 18th century, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, the Great Bach, as he was known in his day, not to be confused with his less well-known father, whose music was pretty much obsolete by 1760, in the opinion of his contemporaries. And C.P. Bach, as we all know, was at the court of Frederick the Great, the obsessive flute-playing king of Prussia, and great military genius, some would say tyrant. He would say enlightened despot, possibly, but he spends his spare time playing flute. Musicians at the court of Frederick famously spent a lot of time writing chamber music and concertos for flute. C.P. Bach didn't do so much of that, but he did write this one extraordinary unaccompanied sonata for solo flute, I think in 1747 in A minor. And like the Fantasias by Telemann, his godfather, which had come out a decade previously, and who knows, maybe he knew them, maybe very likely he knew them. It's a sort of whole concert. It's a whole world of musical styles in one short 10-minute span of music. It begins with a sort of a melancholy arioso dripping with a sort of sentimental, expressive style that's becoming fashionable. It goes into a very bustling sort of Baroque style central movement, all that sort of contrapuntal working, somehow translated into an instrument that can only ever play one line, and then it rounds off with just a really, really entertaining jig. No one knows quite why he wrote it. It wasn't published for some years afterwards, and one thought is that he basically provided it for Frederick the Great to take with him on campaign when he was out in the field in tents, sort of attacking the Austrians or the French or the Poles or whoever. After a busy day waging war, he could retreat to his royal tent, retreat into his private quarters and pull out the flute and just have something worthwhile to play, possibly. That's just a theory. It's quite an appealing one. But the piece itself is, I mean, all the major flute players today still play it, and it's a terrific little piece. And it's a reminder there wasn't only one Bach who did music for unaccompanied instruments. It doesn't have to be a string instrument, and also that this fantastic connection with Telemann, his godfather and sort of friend and mentor, friend of the family, and it shows how this stuff, there's more of this stuff going on than we think, more of it out there.
I had to go quite a long way back into my mind for this one, because as a percussionist, you're often quite jealous of other instrumentalists with solo works, because there are plenty of solo percussion works, but in order to play them, you tend to have quite a lot of gear, and that's not gear that you just happen to have lying around, or indeed you could just turn up and do. No one really wants to hear a 15-minute snare drum sonata, although they do exist. So in a way you get quite jealous, and particularly of course of the tunes. I mean, you can play a marimba solo, and of course Evelyn Glennie has made a number of those quite famous as well, beautiful pieces, but they're keyboard pieces, so they're cheating. I wouldn't want to choose them. But Charlotte's mentioned at least 3 of my choices in the opening sentence, so I shall be rather predictable from now on. But actually, the one I'm going to start with is the Paganini 24th Caprice. I mean, obviously he wrote 24 caprices, but the 24th is the most famous one. We all know the other versions of it, whether it be Rachmaninoff or Andrew Lloyd Webber or whoever. A very, very famous tune, but of course this is the original, and it is one of those great showpieces. There's no question. It's one that a lot of violinists do as an encore. At least they used to, until suddenly Bach seemed to be the only composer in existence for string encores. But the 24th remains very famous as a tune, but actually also untouchable in a way to anyone who isn't a violinist. There are moments in it, like there are in so many solo instrumental pieces, where if you don't play that instrument, you wonder how on earth you can possibly play it, particularly when you look at the music, the sheet music, and you think, goodness gracious, how on earth do you ever get around that? I think that a lot about piano pieces, but I certainly think about that with a lot of violin pieces, and particularly with violinists who I admire, who've got these enormous fingers. I've never understood how so many great violinists have got these enormous sausage fingers and yet have the most amazing dexterity around this tiny instrument. It's extraordinary. Anyway, I mean, it doesn't really need very much introduction, the 24th Caprice, but I went off to listen to many, many different versions of it, because I have a couple of favorites anyway. I love Vengerov doing it. in his heyday, because he had the showmanship of it. And I don't think you can play that piece without being a proper showman, sort of taking on the Paganini feel of that piece. And so I love what he does with it. There's a Heifetz recording, amazing, it's been remastered, but that's with piano. So that doesn't count that version at all. But the one I love is a guy called Alexander Markov, who sort of, I suppose, physically modeled himself on Paganini, the sort of the long hair and the showmanship, and almost like that kind of improvisatory feel about the whole piece, which I love. And he plays it. I mean, it's technically extraordinary, but it's not by any sense the best recording of it, really. But it's the one for me that has the most energy, and perhaps is closest to that kind of street sound of just picking up a violin and playing it. That maybe is what Paganini was going about. You know, you hear all these great things about Paganini being able to play, you know, entire pieces just on the G string, you know, this extraordinary technique. And I think Markov gets close to that. So it's not technically perfect by any means, but I really don't want that technical perfection in this piece. I think it's one of those, it's so famous really as a piece. It needs that sort of extra oomph for me to be attracted to it. And there's that amazing section where they do the pizzicato on the left hand on the fingerboard, and then the ricochet of the bow, and this extraordinary mix of those two things very, very fast, which is, I think, is the bit that I always go to listen to and see how everyone does it. And everyone does it differently. And again, it's one of these great pleasures of these pieces is that there's the music on the page as Paganini wrote it, but everybody does it differently. And I find that really fascinating. But anyway, I think the 24th Caprice has to be in there, not just because it is a great solo work, but also what it led to, because it led to lots of other great works as well. So yeah, that's the Paganini 24th Caprice. Charlotte, another one from you?
That moment always reminds me of Popcorn. I love it.
Yeah.
Let's stick with Paganini then. And the Grand Caprice, Opus 26 on Schubert's Erlkönig, that Paganini's pupil Heinrich Wilhelm Ernst wrote. Now, as I say, Ernst, pupil of Paganini, and there's no beating about the bush here. He called it a caprice. Paganini's pupil. This was for solo violin. The whole purpose of this was to make people's jaws hit the floor as they watched. And it's also a piece that it's really, really hard to play perfectly. Technical perfection. I mean, you can strive for it, but frankly, there are going to be intonational glitches, I think, and you just have to accept that. It's stretching techniques to the limits. The whole point of Ernst was that he wrote a series of studies where his goal was to just stretch the violin beyond, I think, even what Paganini had managed. There's another piece called The Last Rose of Summer, which is number 6 of his polyphonic studies, where it's bonkers difficult. But what I love about Erlkönig is a brilliant choice. And first of all, there's the theatrical side of it. I mean, the Gothic horror, this horrific Goethe text all about this poor child's life snatched out of its father's arms by the Elf King as he gallops towards safety on a dark night. I mean, it's horrific. There's an extent that I can't read the poem. I still find it so horrible. But it's a wonderful piece. And the link is that Schubert loved Paganini. He was a violinist himself, a pretty good violinist. And when Paganini visited Vienna in 1828, Schubert, who was in his late 20s at the time, was so absolutely desperate to go and hear Paganini that he splurged all the money that he'd just received for a rare concert appearance, a paid concert appearance that he'd had, on 2 tickets so that he could take him and a friend to go and hear Paganini because he thought he was so wonderful. And Erlkönig, multiple voices, harmonics, left-hand pizzicato, eerie sol punticello techniques, which is when you play almost on the bridge, the bow almost on the bridge, so it emphasizes the harmonics. And of course, for sort of a ghostly horror piece, it's absolutely perfect. And that's the thing, this piece, it captures the kind of the high-pitched horror, almost hysteria of the poem, this taut tension. And it is mostly high register. I mean, you can actually listen to a 10-minute version of it. It would start to grate probably. But as it is in this kind of leader length, it's perfect. And even through all this sort of busy Gothic horror, this Viennese flavour just creeps through still, even though it's Ernst. I find the whole thing absolutely wonderful. And interesting, Hilary Hahn says that it's one of the pieces that when she's doing encore after a concert, people will be shouting from the back of the hall, play old König, because it's a real party. It's a party piece. It's a crowd pleaser. And your ears don't know where to focus on. There's so much going on.
Yeah. Richard, as a cellist, have you got any cello pieces in your choices? Because that's one hell of a rich world, isn't it? There's solo cello.
There's a lot more out there than people think. I mean, there's this. Do you remember we had Gareth Davis of the LSO on a while before Christmas, and he was talking out. He doesn't tend to go to flute conventions because he gets tired of hanging out with flute people.
Yes,
basically, and a lot of the solo cello stuff is largely of interest to what you might call cello people, who again I too tend to shun despite playing the thing. But the certain pieces that really do come out. I mean, we've mentioned the Bach suites already, which everyone has in their repertoire. The Telemann Gamba sonatas. The one I wanted to mention, though, is a 20th century work, which I think every cellist really, perhaps even more than the Bach, more than almost any other work in the repertoire, cellists just contemplate with absolute awe and astonishment, and in my case, blind terror, because there's no way I could ever get close to playing it, which is the Kodai, unaccompanied cello sonata, Opus 8, written in the First World War in 1915 in Hungary. Height of that sort of period of which he and Bartók together rediscovering folk styles as a basis of modernism, finding a new language, all these extended techniques that they sort of found and seen in the folk world, in the players, folk violins, dance band players, gypsy violinists in Hungary and its hinterland. Incredible techniques, these players, that they're translating into classical terms in a very modern way, in a very modern sounding way. This Kodai cello sonata is a monstrous piece. It's huge. It's nearly 30 minutes in scale. It's 3 huge movements of the most extraordinary virtuosity. Almost anything that can physically be done on a cello occurs at some point in this piece. Double stopping, triple stopping, quadruple stopping, harmonic, spiccato, playing at the top of the register, playing at the bottom of the register, all over the place. It's just it sounds a lot of the time as if there's maybe up to 4 instruments playing. It's that difficult. It's that intense, that richly wrought. And I mean, I find it fascinating because I mean, the virtuosity is breathtaking, but to actually get anywhere near the piece, you can't make it sound that effortful, as you say. The Paganini, you do have to get past all that virtuosity, all that technical accomplishment, and only then does the thing really, really sing. And when it sings, I mean, it's a phenomenally melancholy, powerful, angst-ridden piece. It's almost like a Mahler symphony for solo cello, a Mahler symphony with a huge dose of paprika, obviously, this being Kodai. I mean, a lot of Kodai's music, I mean, I do find him a fascinating historical figure, and there's a lot of his music I like, but of all the sort of great Hungarian composers of the 20th century, he's perhaps overdoes the Hungarian flavour. I think there's always a little too much for it. You can't quite get away from that particular kind of spiciness, which I think he overdoes. In this piece, I think he gets the balance about right. The power, the emotional power does come through. And you need to be able to be absolutely on top of the virtuosity, on the virtuosic elements to do that. And then on top of that, you've got to sustain this 30-minute musical argument, this sense of line, of drama throughout the whole thing. And yeah, I mean, any cellist who can do that is practically a Superman, as far as I can tell. I mean, János Starker is the famous great 20th century interpreter. I was absolutely staggered a couple of years ago by a recent recording by Daniel Muller-Schott, which absolutely seemed to have it. He seemed to wear the virtuosity so effortlessly, but yet he filled it with such emotional intensity. The playing was so beautiful. You didn't always realize how difficult it was technically, but yet that difficulty kind of expressed itself in the emotional power of the piece. You could feel the struggle going on. It wasn't a struggle of a man against his instruments. It's a struggle of music, sort of almost breaking through the medium. And that, I mean, the piece is just, what can I say? It's a masterpiece by any standards. It absolutely terrifies me. I have a colleague in the CPSO, next colleague, Richard Jenkinson, the cellist of the Dante Quartet, who's just written an entire doctoral thesis on performing and interpreting this sonata. It's a work of that sophistication and complexity.
The cello is the cello can almost, you can get away with it really with the more extended pieces, kind of, because it has such an extraordinary range, not just of sound, but of pitch as well. I mean, there's almost nothing you can't do on a cello.
Well, that's it. I mean, you've got a bass. You've got a really good resonant bass on a cello. It goes down nice and deep, so you can get a proper bass on it. And also, equally, I mean, it can go as high as practically any violin if you want to. How you sort of bring those two things together is another question, really. But yeah, I mean, it does have that advantage. Certainly with the flute or the violin, to some extent, you're trying to simulate the effect of a bass. You're trying to pretend there's things there going on there that aren't perhaps really there. It's a brilliant illusion. It's an enormous sonic trompe-l'oeil, which is what Bach does so brilliantly. With the cello, it's not necessary. You can, I mean, and Charlotte mentioned the prelude of the Bach G major suite, and straight away it begins by just brushing the bottom string, the G. The second lowest string of the cello, that rings all the way through the chord. So you've got this lovely deep sonorous bass of what comes after that, and as you move across the strings. And yeah, the cello really has advantages for that. And I mean, there are some terrific other pieces out there. I was going to mention Malcolm Arnold's Fantasy for Solo Cello. He wrote quite late in his career. There's a serenade by Gordon Jacob that I managed to play a bit of once. It was rather a nice piece.
Well, I've got two. I've got two cello pieces on my list.
Wow.
One of the ones I think you're very much going to approve of, Richard. Funnily enough, I really like the Ligeti solo cello piece, which I've heard quite a few times, and it's actually quite conventional for Ligeti. And I was looking for a recording of it, and I found one with Rowan Dasaram, who's the cellist of the Arditi String Quartet, famously very much concentrating on modern music. But I took a big swerve because I decided not then to choose the Ligeti, but to choose a piece from the same album, which I'd never heard before, but I listened to and thought, this is wonderful. And it's Arnold Bach's Rhapsodic Ballad. He wrote a number of pieces for solo cello. This is a 15-minute piece. I didn't know it at all, but loved it. I mean, again, talk about this sort of world that composers create. Bach creates this wonderful, rich tones. Is really using the full range of the instrument, doing it all. I mean, very much like Britten, who I think I'm going to talk about a little bit later, featuring the full range of the instrument without using really any of the tricks, just using the notes, just using the sonorous feel of the instrument, the fullness of that amazing instrument. It's a piece. It was written for Beatrice Harrison, but she didn't play it for the most wonderful reason, and that is because she didn't want her sister May to be jealous, because May quite fancied Arnold Bax, who was a bit of a ladies' man anyway. So she didn't play it. So there you are. Love stuff like that. But it's a totally new discovery for me. And 15 minutes is. I mean, Richard, you're talking about the 30-minute piece of the Kodai, but actually 15 minutes is still quite a substantial piece, and you certainly feel like you have been on a kind of musical journey in that piece. He really takes you on it and really takes you inside the world of it. And Bax is just one of those composers that just keeps giving to me. I keep discovering things by him and thinking, goodness, this is amazing. Why don't we know this better? Why don't we have this program more? He is one of those composers. Just keeps surprising me every step. Do you know the piece, Richard?
I can't say I do. I mean, like I said, I mean, I always covered my shortcomings as a cellist by playing with other people to hide behind, and I really kept well away from the unaccompanied repertoire, which I knew I could. Even if I could play it, there would never be circumstances in which I would want to play it in public because I'd be too scared. So I kind of avoided this stuff really. But Bax, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, that his whole aesthetic is very. I can imagine him being able to do something with that sort of grounding he had in the Irish tradition as well, and also that phenomenal late romantic technique of his. He would have had the mastery and the lyrical impulse. I'm going to look that out and have a listen to it now you've mentioned it. It is a new one to me.
Please do.
So much undiscovered Bax. Yeah.
I will, of course, be putting it on our Spotify playlist as always, which will be available in a couple of days or so. So please do look out for that for versions of all the choices that we've made today. Charlotte, come on, another violin piece from you?
Yes. I'm going to return to the subject of nice guys, and I'm going to go to Isai and his solo violin sonatas. It's an incredible story behind these ones. He sketched them, all 6 of them, in sort of a blizzard of creativity that lasted a mere 24 hours back in 1923. Apparently because he just heard Joseph Szigeti, Here Comes Bach, and the root of so much of this music this week. He'd heard Szigeti play Bach's G minor solo violin sonata, and he'd wondered, why has nobody done this since? And so he set about over 24 hours doing something since. And they're absolutely fantastic. I mean, on the one hand, they're pushing technique. Obviously, that was part of being in the spirit of Bach, to use advancements that had come since Bach's day, such as, sul ponticello, left-hand pizzicato and all that jazz. He was echoing Bach as well. There were noticeable echoes to Bach in the double, triple, quadruple stops. Also, though, he dedicated each of these 6 to a known violinist of the day, and he reflected each violinist's respective musical personality in each sonata. And the whole thing, it just smacks of just utter generosity. One violinist-shaped tribute to Bach and his contemporaries as well, just generous. And Isai was clearly a really wonderful guy, more a violinist than a composer. He composed only for strings music. But these sonatas are wonderful stuff. The first is dedicated to Szigeti. The second, I think it's not the one that I've chosen as my favorite, but it was to Jacques Thibault, who was the wonderful French violinist, co-founder of the Long Thibault violin competition. And he was a close friend of Isai. He was known for his sweet tone. And he also would apparently start his warm-up every day with Bach's E major violin partita. And so the sonata starts with a quote of that, and then it reappears, and it's clearly joshing him, which is just so sweet. Chrysler was another one. Number 4 is dedicated to Chrysler. It's pastiche Bach, which strikes a chord with me because this was what Chrysler did. And when I was learning the violin, I played Chrysler's Preludium and Allegro. I'm quite sure many of the listeners did so as well. And because I had no idea, aged early teens, who Chrysler actually was, I just assumed he was a Baroque composer. And so Isai does this sort of spoof Bach, spoof Baroque sonata for him. But the one that I've chosen is actually number 5 for Mathieu Crickboon, who was a fellow Belgian of Isai's, apparently his favourite pupil. He was second violinist in the Isai quartet before he went and founded his own quartet. And he was a pedagogue on violin technique. He wrote a famous treatise that lots of people used. And this sonata for me is the musical equivalent, the solo violin equivalent of Elgar's Nimrod to Augustus Jaeger, in that it just feels like a great big warm hug. I love you, you are my friend. I'm going to create the most beautiful sonata of the set to you. It starts, it's 2 movements, and the first describes, it's very programmatic, a passage from dawn till full sun, with rustic fourths which sort of grow in long lines, left-hand pizzicato simulating the insects waking up, little circling figures depicting the wind rushing in the bushes. And there's a specific section in the middle where there are these kind of sliding parallel fourths, which might be a reference to Crickboon's treatise, violin treatise. And then you get this rustic dance afterwards, the second movement. And it's possible that this is a memory of one of the things that Isai would do in his pupils, showing again what a nice guy he was. He would hold picnics, rustic picnics, and they would practice their violin exercises under the trees. And I wonder whether he was partly thinking of that when he carved this rustic dance, which again it's full of Bach's jigs, but it's not. I mean, there's so much folk in there as well. So yeah, that's my next choice.
And actually, Richard, forgive me before we come to your next one. It rather connects quite nicely, I think, with one of my choices, which is another one that Charlotte's already mentioned in her opening, which is Britten's 6 Metamorphoses after Ovid for oboe, which is one that was very popular with people who I asked on social media to mention their favourites again, and that one came up a lot. To me, it's a very interesting one. I've not always been a huge fan of the oboe, and with the greatest respect to oboe, it's not an instrument like the cello that has a huge tonal range. So therefore, it's really down to the player, I think, so much the success of a piece. But Britten just is one of those composers, of course, that famously really knew how to write for instruments. It didn't matter what instrument it was, wrote so brilliantly for instruments. And so many players talk about how satisfying he is to play from a technical point of view and just from a pleasurable point of view. Obviously, with just one instrument in a whole piece, that is taken on to another level. But the reason I bring it in now is because, of course, it's 6 character studies, really, isn't it? The piece. It's, among them Pan, Phaeton, Bacchus, Narcissus. These are the characters that he portrays in the music. But when you think about how you do that with just one instrument, and that one instrument is also the oboe, I think it's an absolute, it's a masterclass in how to write for one single line. And it's quite an important piece, actually, to me, as it turns out, because when I was a teenager, I went in for the Kent Young Composer competition, which I ended up winning. But at the beginning of it, when you put all the pieces in, I mean, it was amazing. We got the other composers who were judging. They would write little summaries of the pieces that you'd submitted to enter, and that would support their reason for putting you through to the next stage. I had a couple of pieces that were judged by Judith Weir, and Judith wrote 2 A4 pages about my pieces, which is amazing. But one of the things she put in it was that she felt that I relied far too much on harmony to get the things that I wanted out of the music. And there was nothing wrong with that. But she said, I suggest that he listens, because it was a blind test thing as well, so she didn't know who it was. She said, I suggest this composer listens to some solo instrumental works. And the one she particularly put in was the Britten Ovid pieces for oboe. And she was absolutely right, because of course there you have no comfort of harmony at all, just this one single line. And from a compositional point of view, it is a brilliant exercise to sit down and write a piece that creates an atmosphere and says something that you want to say, but without any harmony at all, just that one line. That is a hard thing to do. And the Britten pieces are, I mean, they are, of course, they're classics, but for me, there is only one person who can play them. And that's Nicholas Daniel, a former guest on this program. I think Nick has a sound that I want to hear, and a personality that comes through that instrument so beautifully and with such great artistry. He is really the only oboist I want to hear play on his own. He knows this, I've told him, but really, as a piece, and as I say, I think it's all about the performer with an instrument like that and a piece like that. And if it's in Nick Daniel's hands, then I'm very, very happy. Is it a piece that did it feature? I don't think it would have featured in Richard's choices, but Charlotte, you mentioned it at the beginning, so it must have been in there somewhere.
It was very up at the top of my consciousness, but I thought that I thought actually you were likely to pick it, Tommy, so I didn't.
There you are. And we kind of knew that Richard probably wouldn't. Go on, Richard, next choice from you.
Well, you mentioned Judith Weir just then, and I there's a couple of pieces I thought about and then dismissed, because I mean they're both vocal pieces, but I just mentioned them in passing, because I wasn't sure that really counted. One is Judith Weir's King Harold's Saga in 1982, which she describes as a grand opera in 3 acts, and it's a grand opera in 3 acts that lasts less than 10 minutes and is written for a single unaccompanied soprano. Originally the great Jane Manning, who is a real absolute champion of contemporary singing in Britain in the 1980s. And yeah, like I said, it's a grand opera describing the Nordic invasion of Britain in the 11th century in 3 acts, as she says, and it's all over in 10 minutes for a single soprano who does everything, all the sound effects, all the singing, tells a story in the most simple, clear. This is what Judith Weir does superbly. She never uses more notes than she needs to. It's an incredible economy of means, and yet such worlds that she summons up. Such an atmosphere, such a sense of presence, of drama, and that thinking about that led me on to another piece for unaccompanied soprano, completely unaccompanied, which is Kathy Barbarian's piece, Stripsody, which is a rather curious title, which perhaps in Britain conveys not really the connotations it was intended to, I've always thought. What she's referring to is comic strips. I've known about this piece for years. I spent time with it last year because I was writing an article about graphic scores. And what she's done is basically she's taken as her basis for the piece. This is in 1966. She takes as a basis for the piece the sound effects and sort of articulated sort of vocals, non-verbal sounds that you get in comic strip cartoons, sort of pow, wham, slam, aye, all that kind of thing, splat. And she's basically constructed this brilliantly virtuosic vocal showpiece, sort of concerto for solo voice, just using these effects, showing the absolute incredible versatility, obviously, of her own voice. And she enlisted a well-known Italian comic book artist to come up to actually put the score together. And the score itself is something you'd always want to pull out and frame. It's got a stave, but on the stave it's got Tarzan swinging across it at one point. It's got like a line just spiraling off and vanishing in a plop at the bottom of the page. All these brilliantly graphic, hilarious sort of illustrations, and you hear her perform it. I mean, it's been performed by many people since her, of course. You hear her perform it, and it's just a phenomenal entertainment and a breathtaking piece of vocal virtuosity. And there are words in there, but it's not really about the words. It's about what sounds you can make with a human voice. I mean, I was listening to Anna Meredith's Concerto for Beatbox and Orchestra over the weekend, and beatboxers, that phenomenon is, I think, something we know more and more about in the classical world now. But this piece of Kathy Barbarian's is sort of taking that even further, and this is 6 decades ago. This brilliantly entertaining and funny piece. I mean, it's one of those pieces that if you automatically makes people feel sympathetic towards experimental contemporary classical music. You put that on a program and everyone is going to smile, no matter what else is on the program.
Well, now is probably the time then to mention a couple of other things that people have recommended on Facebook. And Dom Kelly, who is a oboist, mentions Berrioz's Sequenza 7 for oboe, the Kathy Barbarian link there. He mentions Nicholas Daniels' recording. He says it's the ultimate test. Essentially, how can you make one note interesting? And that applies to both the composition and the performance. It's genius. In fact, sequenzas are mentioned throughout. Ed Shearer, the film composer, he says syrinx, obviously. Syrinx, of course, we must mention here. Graham Fitkin, cusp for clarinet. Andrew Griffith says Peter Maxwell Davis's Sea Eagle for solo horn. I mean, there's so many different pieces to be suggested here, and actually many of them are, in fact, surprisingly, I think, actually 20th, 21st century ones, rather than these sort of more obvious ones. And hardly anyone's mentioned Bach cello suites, for example, on here, which is interesting. I guess that's an indication that people are trying to try a bit harder to think of the ones that we perhaps haven't come across before. And Roger Mullis, the Berrios Sequenza for trombone, number 5, is one that's mentioned there. Charlotte, another one from you?
Well, I think I'll stick with that theme and pick Scarino's 6 Capriccios for solo violin. Is that one of yours too?
What are the odds? What are the odds?
What are the odds?
I can't try harder than that to be off the beaten track. Oh, honestly, really, Charlotte. Go on.
I do. So we might as well just give up and go home.
Yeah, they're all yours.
Yeah. Scarino's 6 Capriccios. We might have chosen a different number though, each. So 6 Capriccios for solo violin. He wrote these in 1976. And this is fascinating music. Scarino, he's sort of interested in the psychology of listening, of perception, of music's capacity to affect. And that all sounds very highfalutin. And what it actually means when it boils down to a piece for solo violin is something that is taking the sounds of the violin to entirely new places, but not, although it's using extended techniques, that's not what you're most aware of. It's about a sound world that he's creating. And there's no programmatic element, but it sounds as though there should be. It's very spatial. It makes you aware of how you are hearing the music in its acoustic of where you are in the surroundings. Instantly, it's making you think and listen in a very different way. Now, some of the capricci is quite violent. They vary in length a lot, but the one I've chosen is number 2, which is about 4.5 minutes long. And the interesting thing about this is that it doesn't sound like one instrument, but not because of polyphony. It's because of the special effects. It's andante, and it's this strange, ghostly, fluttering music in the high harmonics. I'm pretty sure the sol punticello is in harmonics, fluttering, breathy, flute-like trills. There's an almost oriental flavor to it. It sounds like air is the best way to put it. It sounds like oriental air, kind of carved by some kind of elfin fairy. I don't know where. Would you want to pick up from that, Richard?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think you put it magically. That he's a fascinating, I think, composer. I mean, like a lot of these Italian post-war modernists, he really does have that sense of the past and the tradition he's coming out of. As well, I mean, you wouldn't think this music had been written any time before the 1970s, certainly, but there's very clearly this awareness of the tradition he's coming out of, this lyricism. I've always seen him as, I mean, most of the pieces I've known by him for some reason have been nocturnes. He strikes me as a composer who sort of deals with dreams, with shadows, with half lights in a kind of beautiful way, the beauty of the night, sort of moonlight of silveriness. And that really, I mean, that particular one you mentioned was the one that I would have chosen. I think the caprices. It's and I think I'm right in saying, I mean, I first came across them in a program in which, believe it or not, a violinist, this was at the Salzburg Festival, was doing those 6 pieces with all 24 of the Paganini caprices. And the idea was there's a direct line between the, oh God, yeah, I mean, imagine that. I was writing the program notes for that, and wow. I wish I could remember which violinist it was, because, you know, whoa. But yeah, clearly there's a line between them. He was beginning with that sense of the past, which you get that in Berio as well. Berio is always very, very aware of the Italian tradition of opera, of virtuosity, going back to the Baroque, and it sort of infuses his music without ever sort of making it anything other than his own. It's the same with Sciarrino. You get clearly there's that line back to Paganini. There's these references, the way he uses harmonics, double stops, trills, extended techniques, the way the virtuosity goes beyond just virtuosity. I mean, I think that's the thing I wanted to say when Tommy was talking about Paganini earlier. These pieces are not just showpieces. It's not just fireworks. I think this, you probably agree with what you said about the piece by Ernst as well. Is we tend to take these pieces less seriously because we think virtuosity is a frivolous act. But it's very clear if you read contemporary accounts of Paganini, how much he was revered as an artist by the greatest musicians of the day. That Schubert revered him, Berlioz practically worshipped him, Schumann travelled miles to hear him and wrote of him in the most glowing terms. He was clearly a compelling individual who had something very important and significant musically to say through this virtuosity. And I think, you know, Sciarrino takes off from that, Berio takes off from that. A lot of these writers, Isai certainly, takes that idea that the virtuosity on the violin can be it's not that it doesn't have to be a frivolous act. It can create incredible beauty and wonder, which is certainly what these caprices do.
But I get quite tired sometimes of the extended technique. I think coming back to what I was saying before about being able to create a whole world out of simply the sonority of the instrument. I think some composers are perhaps a little scared of doing that. I mean, one of my choices, for example, are the fantasies by Malcolm Arnold, who never uses extended technique of any kind. He wrote a lot of them. I mean, the ones I like are horn, tuba, trombone. The one I was going to choose was the trumpet one. This is pure Malcolm Arnold melodic brilliance from instruments that he knew really, really well. But of course, he doesn't do any of the extended technique stuff because in a way he doesn't have to, because he had that gift of being able to produce melody and make it feel like one long line of music, which a lot of composers obviously can't do, and also not only can't do but don't want to do, of course. But I think always of I made a program about the Darmstadt Festival for Radio 4 once with Christopher Fox, the composer, and he told me, because he used to go there a lot, he told me that once when they were judging pieces, I think, or he was one of the tutors there, they used to have a little cliche list that what composers would turn to with their pieces, and the flute recital came up and they wrote down all the classic extended technique cliches of a flute piece, like clicking of the keys, the breathing across it without actually creating a note and all that. And he said this one piece, the person came on, played this piece, and they ticked off every single one of them in the first 20 seconds. That, I suppose, sort of encapsulates the problem I think I have often with those sorts of pieces. I mean, obviously they have their place.
It's funny.
It's just what Charlotte was saying, though, that if you transcend that, you can use those techniques, but transcend it, make it into an actual piece of music rather than just something that seems to rely on ticks and novelty. That's the key to it.
And funnily, I've heard I've heard Scarino actually paired with Baroque music, where you don't get those extended techniques, and I think that worked very well. Probably maybe for the reason that you're saying, Tommy. And Baroque, you have wonderful, you have very high technique, but they're not extended, and then you have Scarino, who creates a world.
Richard?
Well, I say we can all think of absolutely thousands and thousands of books of studies for solo instruments which are just designed purely to stretch technique, to show off. And I think all these people we're mentioning go a long way beyond that. If they're doing it, it's generally for a reason. I mean, what you said reminded me of something I heard said by the composer Mark Simpson, who wrote a gorgeous cello concerto about 3 years ago, and he's just saying he set himself the challenge for a contemporary composer of writing a cello concerto which just simply used the cello doing what the cello naturally does, instead of assaulting the instrument with the end of the bow, or plucking below the bridge, or detuning it and rattling it against the fingerboard or whatever. He wants to let the cellist play the cello, and the piece was glorious because of that, I think. And yeah, it's a real thing.
Right, let's do a quick roundup then of ones we haven't mentioned yet, in brief, please. Richard, what ones you haven't mentioned yet, in brief, that you think need to be mentioned?
Well, Syrinx has been mentioned by one of our listeners. You said, which what a piece! But, there's the soul of an instrument encapsulated in 4 minutes of incredibly distinctive music that would be by no one else. Just such an atmosphere. What simplicity, and yet what sophistication. I'm sure that is perhaps the greatest, I would say, of all the sort of little encore pieces that exist for woodwind instruments. What else? I was very keen to talk about Bartók's unaccompanied violin sonata, which he wrote for Yuri Menuhin, and he believes Bartók himself thought it would be unplayable until the first time he heard Menuhin play it. He said he didn't imagine that in his lifetime anyone would be able to play the piece that well as Menuhin played it. And the interesting thing is, although like Kadai, his great friend and colleague from Hungary, all sorts of wild, crazy extended techniques going on in the earlier movements, was this third movement, the Melodia, which does just what you're talking about, Tommy. It just takes a line of music and spins a melody, which Bartók could do. And then the finale, he somehow creates one of these folk dance finales, like in the Bach Concerto for Orchestra or the Third Piano Concerto, with just the one instrument. So communicative, and at the same time so brilliantly challenging and intellectually testing as well. I mean, for me, Bartók is the great 20th century master. I rate him above Stravinsky. He's the man for me. I'm always keen to talk about him. I was going to mention Prokofiev's unaccompanied violin sonata, but technically he wrote that to be played by numerous unaccompanied violinists playing together in unison, apparently, which is a fascinating idea. And again, that really is what you say. It's an exercise in melody. I mean, who better than Prokofiev to do that? Singing, sweet, flowing, Russian, lucid melody, just trying to capture the spirit of the violin for young players, though extremely skilled young players. I think these are advanced students, all playing together. But I say it's not really a solo piece for that reason. And I mean, I did want to talk about Malcolm Arnold's fantasies for wind instruments, which I think you said you were going to mention, Tommy.
Yeah.
I mean, the Birmingham connection is one reason why I'm aware of these pieces. The fact that the first 5 are all commissioned by the CBSO for their international woodwind competition in 1966. Single movement works, and they had on the panel Sir William Glock, Nadia Boulanger, Adrian Bolt, and I seem to remember it's Arthur Baker, the general manager of the CBSO, probably Hugo Rignold as well, the then conductor. And yeah, these little 4-minute miniatures that just capture the personality of the instrument and test the players. The 5 I know are the ones for the woodwind quartet: oboe, clarinet, flute, bassoon, and one for horn as well. And that first one, the competition was won by James Galway, launching his career with that piece, the Malcolm Arnold Fantasy for Flute, which
whatever happened to him?
I know.
Yeah, but what I love about the pieces, what I love about the fantasies, they're such generous pieces. They're pure Malcolm in that sense. They're taking on the personality of that instrument. And again, he was another one like Britten who's just wrote so brilliantly for all instruments. But I think particularly for brass, he was a great trumpeter, former principal of the LPO, for example, before he became a full-time composer. They're just generous pieces. They're the sort of piece that you just want to luxuriate in as a player. I want to sit down and I want to play this music because it's been written for me. That was his real gift, I think.
He was a man who had music to spare, I think, about him, didn't he? And he really understood the instruments. I think he loved the personalities of the instruments, and it comes out. I mean, we have the original manuscripts at CBSO Centre in Birmingham where I used to work, and I used to go and look at them in spare hours just to sort of cheer myself up. And
nice.
And they're beautiful. They're just so clear. It's elegant looking scores. They sound so effortless, yet they're so beautifully crafted.
Two more I want to throw in. I must mention the Britten solo cello suites because I think they are phenomenal entries in that repertoire. The second one I think is probably my favorite. I mean, they were all written for Rostropovich. And again, as is so often with Britten, I mean, we talked about this when we were talking about Peter Pears last year with Thomas Allen, this unavoidable link that Britten has with his players, with the people he wrote it for, the way he manages to bring those personalities into his music, none more so perhaps away from Pears than for Rostropovich with the cello suites. I think they're such rich pieces and there's so much in there. They're always worth revisiting. Again, another sort of full range of that instrument without many of the tricks. The last one I'll throw in is Penderecki's Capriccio for tuba. I must choose a piece for tuba because I love the tuba and I lived with tuba players and tuba has been part of my life. This is a later period Penderecki. This is not the Threnody piece with there's a real hard modernism that we so associate with him as a composer. This is when he started to get a bit more tonal, and it's a capriccio. It's a proper lively work for tuba, showing off its virtuosity, and it's great to have a tuba be virtuosic because it so often doesn't get that opportunity. It was written in 1980. I'm told by tuba players that the thing to do is to try and play it fast and as fast as you can, and that's when it starts to get tricky. I mean, the jumps between the notes are massive often, and that's the tricky bit for them, the virtuosic bit for them technically. But a great piece to listen to. It's not very long, but again, the full range of emotions and techniques and ideas in one big, lovely instrument like the tuba. Finally, Charlotte, someone's to throw in from you.
Well, like Richard, the Bartók Sonata for the G major Sonata for solo violin, that was one of mine. And Richard's really described it wonderfully already. But an area of it that I particularly love is the presto, where you have this ear grabbing. We're talking about raiding the toolbox of extended techniques, and then you have this wonderful melodia, adagio. But I also love how at the start of the presto you have this fabulous bumblebee motif that it's not an extended technique as such, but he's using quarter tones, and then Menuhin had to score them into Western notation for him, and the effect of it's absolutely brilliant, very theatrical, and then especially theatrical when suddenly this Bach dance begins off the back of it, when you take the mute off and suddenly it's kapow. And then sticking with theatre, Pierre Boulez's Anthem, the first one, now that is pure theatre. It's for solo violin again. He wrote it in, I think, 1992 for the Menuhin competition. So I mean, it is a tick box of every single extended technique you can think about. Let's be honest there. But he's done it in such a way that actually what emerges is a piece of theatre. And the trick is to sort of, you have these highly rhythmic sections, and they are separated by glissandi harmonics and floating, more improvisatory sections. And it's a piece that chucks you into an entirely different world if you can play it right, which clearly at a competition, not every young artist does. I'm quite sure there were some very painful performances that year, but I mean, it's a great piece. And then other ones, Britten solo cello sonatas, that was on my list too. He's a melodist. Again, it's him just carving beautiful melodies that just tap into the soul. David Matthews wrote a really interesting piece a few years back for Guy Johnston, Ein Celloleben, which charts the development of the cello across 3 centuries, and it quotes in harmonics from Corelli's Christmas Concerto, quotes Beethoven as well. It's rather lovely and constantly shifting landscapes. And then Bieber wrote a Passacaglia in G minor for solo violin. Now, it's nowhere near the depth of a Bach Passacaglia, but there's a lilting beauty and there is some depth to it. It's about 8 minutes long and it's rather lovely. And then the final thing that I would say is that Carl Friedrich Abel wrote a whole bunch of absolutely sublime viola da gamba solo sonatas, pieces of all sorts, which you can find very easily online, and they're rather lovely. It's late night music, that one.
Yeah, lovely. Well, as always, the full range of music in one handy to listen to podcast. Thank you very much, Charlotte and Richard, as always. We'd love to hear your ideas too, so just use the hashtag Classical Top 5 on Twitter, or you can find us at Classical Top 5 there as well, or on our Facebook page. Just search for Classical Top 5. Always wonderful seeing all your suggestions. We'd also like your suggestions of what subjects to cover in the podcast. Is there one we've missed out that you're dying to hear us discuss? I'm sure there must be. So let us know about that too. We love your ideas. So please send those through, or you can email us classicaltop5@gmail.com. For now, though, thank you very much for listening, and we'll welcome you back next week.